Well, good morning, everyone.
Yeah,
My name is Peter Mashasik. I'm the Director of Stewardship for the Diocese of Toronto, and I'm also the host of this session on the myths about homelessness. We are glad that you're able to join us for this workshop today. And as we gather, we aim to create a community where we can respect and honor each other and hopefully learn a thing or two about homelessness and engage in some conversation. Uh, in order to help things go faster and safer and easier, we have a few norms that we would like to impress on you. And these include when you're not speaking, please keep your microphone muted. When you are speaking, take your time, be clear as possible, and make it easier for others to hear you. Rather than responding to a speaker immediately, please share your questions in the comment section or in the chat section, and then I can relay those questions accordingly to our speaker here today. We welcome people to participate at their level of comfort. So please know that this session is being recorded, and everyone is invited to share video if they are willing. If you prefer, you can turn your camera off. We respect everybody. Disagreement is natural, but respect is unwelcome. Uh,
Yes.
and uh, and as your moderator, I will step in if I feel that the conversations are becoming too excessive or too heated. Um, so I would like to introduce a colleague, but someone and someone who is also very well known in the Diocese of Toronto, Christian Harvey, the Reverend Christian Harvey from Peterborough. Um, he is a deacon in our diocese. He's also the executive director of One City Peterborough, a multi-service grassroots
Not sure that
organization.
there is a.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, please
Yeah.
mute. Please mute.
It probably has a switch. Did you get a manual?
Please mute.
Maybe go for
Thank you. So he is committed to a community where everyone belongs to, and together we flourish. Um, One City Peterborough is they do this by supporting individuals who have experienced homelessness and or criminalization with meeting immediate needs, breaking down barriers within the community, and advocating for systemic change. Christian is a public educator, a community builder, a music lover, and obviously a cleric as well. And we are grateful and we welcome him here this morning. And I pass things over to him that he may begin his presentation.
Thanks so much, Peter. It's really great to be here, and the outreach conference is. I've had the pleasure of being a part of it for probably like 20 years now, so it feels pretty great to be back and to be here with you today. Um, I will say just about me as a speaker, I'm a pretty needy speaker, which means I like in person better because I like the energy that people give when they're like laughing or, I grew up Pentecostal, so a few amens work really well for me. But I recognize that Zoom doesn't play as well for that. That's okay. But what I would like to say is I would love that interaction to happen throughout the time. So you don't feel like you need to wait for the end to ask any questions. Throw them in there, and Peter will stop me, and I'll try and watch the chat as well. Sometimes I get on a bit of a roll and forget to look, but I will come back to it. As Peter said, my name is Christian Harvey. I'm executive director of One City Peterborough and a deacon with All Saints Peterborough. And what I want to talk to you today about is myths about homelessness. And this is actually a very important presentation for me and for us as an organization. We've been doing this a lot because we believe, and I think it's true, that the solutions that we posit to an issue are always directly connected to the stories we tell about that issue. So if we believe something that the reason something is happening is this, it's going to alter the solutions we present. So if we don't spend time actually looking at the stories we tell about an issue, we're never going to come up with the right solutions to it. And when it comes to homelessness right now, what we know is that almost every story understands homelessness as being rooted in the moral or just personal failure of the homeless individual. We so often tell these stories. Well, scholars will call it pathologizing the issue, right? We root the problem in being the individual in its simplistic form, that the individual experiencing homelessness is making bad choices. Let's help them make better choices. I mean, that's simplistic, and that comes out in like in more like policing matters. Like, how do we just put laws in place that make certain practices illegal, so to de-incentivize an issue, you know, that sort of thing. So bylaws that are passed to make tenting illegal. That is rooted in the idea of trying to de-incentivize people to be homeless, because it's rooted in the idea that people are choosing it. That people, you know, that it's the failure of the individual. We need to incentivize them to make better choices. On a more compassionate note, it's rooted in how do we just journey alongside people more so that they can make better choices themselves. Both of them are rooted in the same story, that the reason we're experiencing homelessness is rooted in the homeless individual. And my belief is that is a false place to start. And as long as we start in that place, we will always come up with inadequate solutions. Now, it's weird for me to say that as someone who's the executive director of an organization that primarily runs emergency-based services. I run, you know, when people name all the charity stuff, we run them all, right? We have an overnight low barrier shelter that we operate. We have a meal program that's running every day that feeds about 200 people every day. We have emergency vet services. We have all the employment services. We run affordable housing, all those sorts of things. So we do a lot of emergency services. And one of the things that we realized a few years ago is we were concerned that we were actually enabling. But the enabling that we were worried about was not the individuals experiencing homelessness. That's not our concern. We weren't feeling like we were enabling them. That by cleaning up and hiding the issue of homelessness and food security, that we were actually enabling a system that was constantly making oppressive decisions, and we were allowing them to continue that process. And that actually nonprofits like ourselves, One City Peterborough, and many churches, why we get funding from government is because they want us to hide the issue. An example of this is we ran a low barrier shelter for quite a few years, and because of conflict with the funder, which was the government, around what they thought we should operate, in particular around issues of harm reduction, our funding was cut. So, you know, if we think of it, we operated this shelter that was sheltering about 40 to 50 people every night. On July 30th, our funding was cut, and on the next day, a tent city emerged in Peterborough. Okay, so all of a sudden there's 40 people tenting in a park. What then happened is that the whole community was like, we have a homelessness emergency. Now, the interesting thing is there was no more people experiencing homelessness on that day than there was for the months ahead of time. The only difference was that people could see it, right? That was the only difference. And what we realized at that moment is, oh, we are funded mostly to hide the issues from the community. And we, at that time, decided that if we're going to be an organization that's a rug that the issue is brushed under, we're going to be an ugly shag carpet in the middle of the room that everyone's like, what is that carpet doing there? Why is that here, right? We're going to be this loud carpet that you can't ignore. Because we do believe that it's essential for us to be supporting the individuals who are in the midst of homelessness, right? It doesn't help anyone to allow people to just have no shelter, to have no food. But at the same time, we have to be loud about it. So for us, doing things like this is about saying, okay, let's get to the heart of what actually is happening. Why are people experiencing homelessness? And is it true that it's rooted in the bad decisions of the individual, or is it something greater? So that's what we're going to spend our time on. And if we have time, I'm guessing most of you aren't here because you're on the fence about whether we should be compassionate around homelessness. If you're coming to the outreach conference and you're coming to something that's myths about homelessness, my guess is most of you are here because you want to have more resources so that you can have conversations with people who maybe aren't as convinced. And so if we have time, we're going to spend some time on how do we have meaningful conversations with those who we're trying to persuade. Someone I just see
Christian, I'm just gonna
yeah.
Christian, I'm just gonna interject as the questions come in, and they've asked, what is a low barrier shelter?
That is it's a really good question, and it's a little bit contentious because a lot of places will say that they are low barrier. But what we mean by low barrier shelter is that a shelter that has very few barriers to accessing. Those barriers might be, we allow someone to access if they're under the influence of substances, right? So someone can be high, intoxicated, all those sorts of things. We don't actually ask people to leave if they're using substances. People can come with their significant other. So a lot of shelters are gendered. Ours is not, which also allows individuals who are transgender and non-binary to not have to disclose what they identify as in order to access. We allow pets to access. People can come in and out. Those sorts of things. A lot of things that result. I mean, we have a lot of other pieces around it, but those are things that we understand it. We also don't have security guards. That's one of the things that we don't have. We don't do bag checks, none of those things. Okay, I'm gonna. So let's start going to these through these myths. And what again? I'd love you to throw up your questions as we go. So the first myth that I think is most common is that people choose to be homeless. Now this is an interesting one, I think, because and it's really core a lot to almost every other myth, is that homelessness is the choice of the individual. But the question is always the choice between what and what. Most individuals who are experiencing homelessness do not have, though there is choice in their life, we all have some sort of autonomy. Their choice isn't between, say, a 2-bedroom apartment in a nice neighborhood and living in a tent, right? A friend of mine would say, it's between living in a tent, living in a shelter that you're with 40 other people in a room, or living in a rooming house where there's drugs, bugs, and thugs, right? Like he's like, it's not this clear decision. Like there's a lot of great choices, and I'm choosing the bad one. If you talk to individuals who are living outside, who are living in an encampment, the reasons they have for living there are, I would say, very reasonable, right? We often moralize and think this is the decision you should make. Faith. I see your hand up there, Faith.
Good morning, everyone. How are you doing this morning? I hope you're all doing well. Yes, I would like to say when it comes to homelessness, in some cases, we have to really look at the bigger picture. For people, sometimes it's choices, sometimes it's meeting in the wrong group and so forth. We have mental health that create situation in our lives. We associate with the wrong folks, got caught up in a spiral effect, and we need to look at it from a number of avenues. So I don't think people really make decisions to say, I want to be homeless. There has to be something significant that happened in their lives for them to become homeless. You know,
I think you're exactly right, Faith.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't work like that. There is situation, and it's not that we as Canadian cannot do better. We can do better as a country, as a people, when we start showing as to the world that we still are human beings and we care about humanity. You know, our ratings are not the same as how it was because we tend to become a people who have lost our values and principle and caring spirit toward humanity. And when people fall, we're supposed to be there to pick them up in this country. And, and not only that, we're creating Band-Aid solutions. Right. We're creating Band-Aid solutions for them. The mayor of, for example, I'm going to use a scenario. The mayor of Brampton is creating a program where it's not really taking away their rights when someone becomes homeless. Is really to helping them get back on track, especially ones who are impacted by substance abuse.
Faith,
they need help.
Faith, I think we're going to cover some of this stuff. So do you mind if I pause and we'll come back to this, if that's okay?
For sure.
I think you're exactly right. Is that is that we have that, and these myths I think are really destructive. I think you're exactly right. And so let's take some time to really look at them, right? So this idea, I think you're right, people don't choose to be homeless, and it's not rooted in the individual, right? And so we can look at, Louise says, another choice might be to remain living with an abusive partner. Again, the choices aren't easy, right? And so when we say people are choosing this, what we're trying to do is really move to this idea that it's their fault that they're in this situation. And it kind of absolves us from the responsibility. Many are choosing between freedom, are having to make this choice between freedom and safety. And that's, I think, really important. Like, that's a hard decision that people have to make. And I think holding that place is difficult. Yeah. All right, I'm going to move. I want to show you this study. There was a study done that we were involved in here in Peterborough that asked individuals why they didn't stay in shelter. And you can see here that so looking at what are the reasons that people decided not to stay in shelter, most common reason, too many restrictions and rules. Now, often that is used against individuals experiencing homelessness, but let's be honest, none of us would knowingly check ourselves into prison, right? Like, that's not what and yet we've set up our shelter more and more as if they're carceral institutions, where you have to have your bags checked, where you're being watched all the time, all those pieces. And so that is something that we know when we say, okay, why aren't people using shelters? A major reason is that there's too many. We treat it as if they are children, and as if they don't, as if it's a prison. Secondly, the big one is that for those who use substances, our shelters actually put their lives at risk. When we tell someone around substance use, you cannot access here and use substances, and then but that's not really how substance use works. We're making it so that people are going to use in washrooms, are going to have to be forced to use by themselves. And so what that results in is the greater likelihood of people dying, right? So if I'm using substances, a shelter is actually less safe for me, right? And so we can have these conversations. Why are people choosing encampments over shelters? Why are people making these choices? It's not unreasonable. People are doing what they need to survive. What we also know, and what we see in what we've seen, is that autonomy is a core human need, right? And so we often create systems for people who are experiencing homelessness, and the first thing we do is we take away any autonomy that they might have, right? We remove that. And yet we know any studies on trauma and trauma-informed care, any studies on what person-centered programming looks like, knows that bringing autonomy in is key to having successful programs. But I don't need to look to studies. I need to look at my own life and be like, I want to have a say on what happens in my life. I do not want to just give up my autonomy so that others are making the decisions on what is right for me. And yet our systems so often remove that. We also tell the story. I don't know if this happens in other communities, but in Peterborough, we have fought this battle over and over and over again around the rhetoric that there's enough shelter beds for everyone. And this is so dangerous. We always, as soon as there's one shelter bed open, the rhetoric from those in power is typically, we have shelter beds and people are choosing not to use them. So we must not need to do anything, right? Which is, we know, isn't the key. So why is it that we so want to tell this story that it's people's choice that is resulting in homelessness? Well, the reason is it allows us to scapegoat the individual. It allows us to say the reason homelessness is happening is because those individuals are making their own choices. But you can see how then the flip side of it is always going to be that all our answers are now based on how do we help the individual make better choices, when what we can see at the core is often it's the system making really destructive choices. But it allows us to not focus on that, because in my head, to understand that homelessness is because people are making bad choices is easier to understand than to understand that we've been making bad political choices for the last 30 years. And that seems very hard to get out of, because it is, right? Like the answer to our homelessness crisis is complicated. And I would love to say it's going to be simple, and it's just We just need to do a little bit more, you know, it's more around individual kindness and all that sort of stuff. But it actually is around huge systemic shifts that need to happen. And that is a lot more daunting. So we would rather tell the story that if we can just help people make better choices, the homelessness crisis will be eliminated. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. All right, number 2. Homeless people are lazy. Now this is, has anyone ever heard this before? Once or twice? I mean, this is interesting. I was just thinking about this a little bit this morning. Why this comes out. I mean, one is I think we are obsessed with worth being connected to working and working being connected to money. Because what we know and what I've experienced in being able to learn from people who are experiencing homelessness for the last 15 years, 20 years, is that surviving homelessness is a lot of work. Like it is hard, right? I do not have to think about where I'm having my shower every morning, right? I literally am not thinking while I'm walking towards the shower. I am not considering where do I need to go to get my next meal, and is someone going to be there who wants to beat me up or who I owe money to? I don't have to think about that, right? I don't have to think about how am I going to make sure that I get a little bit money for this or that. None of those things are things that I have to figure out on a daily basis. The other side that I was thinking about just today is that when I rest in places that have been deemed socially acceptable, and so no one judges me for it. But when someone who's experiencing homelessness rests, it's in places that we judge as being not right, right? And so we see that as being laziness. The other thing that I think is really fascinating about this, I mean, what I will also say is we operate an employment program that employs individuals who are experiencing homelessness in doing street cleaning, which is a little bit of a subversive program for a few reasons. One is because we know that most of the individuals that we support are talked about, like when people talk about the need to clean up the downtown, they're usually not talking about garbage. They're talking about people, right? Which right there should be a flag for how unjust our system is when we're talking about certain groups of people, as if they're people that need to be cleaned up. But the other interesting thing about that is that having this group of people that are often seen as the ones who are the people that make our downtown dirty, doing the cleaning, is kind of a little bit of a, I'm going to show you a little bit. But that's why we've developed this program. What we've found is we have never struggled with hiring. We have 25 spots every summer, and we always have way more applicants than we have spots, right? There has never been this, we have never seen this idea. Our shelter we're in an old United Church that we've converted into a shelter drop-in center, all that sort of stuff. And what we have found is that many of those who use the space also are tidying it up on a regular basis and those sorts of things. So that is not our experience. But the other is that a lot of people do work that we just we don't see as being legitimate. So whatever your thoughts are on panhandling is a lot of work. If you've ever done fundraising where you're asking people for money, you know that it is emotionally difficult work, right? You're getting prepared for rejection on a regular basis. You're getting ready for someone to get mad at you. Now imagine you're starting from a point where people already see you as worth less than others. And now you're engaging. Like, you might not like that panhandling exists, but to say it's laziness would only be if you haven't done panhandling, because it is not a lazy person's work. Similarly, things such as picking. I don't know if this is something that's big in Toronto, but in Peterborough it's big, where individuals who are experiencing homelessness will, or not, but who will go early in the morning and go through recycling bins, taking all the bottles and cans that can go to the liquor store and get the money for that. Picking is not easy, right? The routes that individuals are doing, they're getting up often really early in the morning. They're doing long routes carrying a lot of metal and glass. Again, picking, you might not like that picking exists. You might be against the idea that picking happens, but it is not laziness, right? Survival isn't laziness. These different types of work that we have are not laziness. They're just not things that we necessarily, we might reject their type of work, but it's not laziness. And so that is definitely something that I have not seen as being the reason why people the people are homeless is because they won't work. That is not what I've seen for sure. So someone just said, when people with a prison record seek employment, they're often automatically disqualified. Exactly, Nancy. That is something we see a lot of, and we really try in our own employment to find ways in which to avoid that. The other is it's actually a lot of the ways in which say the criminal record checks that are done for almost every job now are actually like a violation of their human rights, right? You're not allowed to do criminal record checks for positions that have nothing to do, that aren't going to be affected by a certain criminal record. But it doesn't matter, because if you say no to it, you are going to be rejected for that job. So you're put in a corner. Again, this is rooted in our ideas of dignity and worth, right? Someone is not worth our time to help if we see them as being lazy. And so if we can disqualify them as lazy, it allows us to not have to feel responsible for caring for them. Our next one, harm reduction makes things worse. I think this is really important, right? Because this is one of the major narratives that's coming out right now. We are all feeling that our communities are changing and not changing for the better, right? We are feeling that there's more and more, we are faced with people who are in desperate situations on a regular basis now. We are having to see it, and that makes us incredibly uncomfortable, right? And we want to do something about it. And I think what's beginning to happen is there's a story that harm reduction is not working towards the community that we want, which is that community that maybe we imagine we once had, where we all felt safe going to parks and we felt better about life and all those sorts of things, right? And so normally, I see where there's this turn against harm reduction is the idea that harm reduction is actually making things worse as opposed to making things better. I think this is important to wrestle through. The first thing I want to say is we have to recognize that the majority of people who suffer from mental health and or addiction are not experiencing homelessness. So it is not that mental health and and addiction equal homelessness, because there's many so there's always another factor involved, right? If someone, that doesn't mean it doesn't play a factor, but let's not pretend it is the sole factor. The fact that housing has become commodified, the fact that rents are unachievable, all those sorts of things are as big a factor, right? Because there's many people who are experiencing homelessness who are experiencing mental health or addiction who aren't experiencing homelessness. So that's important. It's rare, so it's rarely the sole factor. And though homelessness does increase the impacts of mental health and substance use, it's not always clear that mental health and or addiction equals homelessness. Sometimes it is a major factor that results in someone experiencing homelessness. Oftentimes it's also the other way. Someone experiences homelessness and addiction and mental health becomes major issues because of that, right? The cycle can go either way. But what I think is important here is that when we engage in harm reduction, it is not about making things worse. Harm reduction is about keeping people alive until we're able to connect them to the supports that are desperately needed but are inadequate in this time, right? We know we have certain government spokespeople who are talking about safe consumption sites as drug dens. That is, I mean, clearly the person's never been to one, but the flip side of it is that's not what it's about, right? What I like to say is I'm very committed to loving my neighbor as myself, and I can't love my neighbor who's dead. So I want to do everything I can do to try and keep my neighbor alive as best as I can, so that eventually we can connect people to the services they need. But interestingly enough, right, we look at, so recently what's becoming a topic of conversation is forced treatment, right? That's an interesting choice when we don't have enough treatment for those who want it right now. Why would we force people to engage in treatment when we don't have the treatment beds that is needed for all those who are waiting for it right now, right? Let's start by just providing treatment to those who want it, which is a huge amount of people, it's incredibly hard to access treatment. And then if we're finding that then we need to move to forced treatment, okay. But right now we're not even offering the treatment that's needed. And so in the absence of treatment, harm reduction saves lives, right? It keeps people alive. And that's why we're committed to it. And so harm reduction is not making the issue worse. The issue has been made by decisions where we forced people into survival mode. The increase in inequality in Canada, which is at the highest it's ever been since we've been tracking it. All those sorts of things are the amount of desperation that we see manifested through substance use is a symptom of that. And we're not, by allowing people to die, we're not going to solve that. And so harm reduction is about keeping people alive. And it is connected. It is very hard to engage in work around homelessness without engaging in harm reduction. Because let's be honest, shelter is harm reduction, right? Like shelter itself is harm reduction. Shelter does nothing to end homelessness. Shelter is about eliminating the harm or reducing the harm of someone who has no access to housing. Food programs are harm reduction. Our meal program does not increase someone's food security. It does nothing to touch their food security. It's harm reduction. In a time when people can't afford to buy food, we are doing harm reduction by providing food. So it's similar. And then when there is not treatment available for individuals, giving needles that are unused, safe consumption sites, safe supply is harm reduction, is keeping people alive. So I think this is it's a bit of a different one, but I think it's really important to root in this. Any thoughts or questions on this so far? Okay. They can't manage their money. This is such an interesting one. Oh yeah, Eddie.
Thank you really very much, Christian. We really appreciate the insights you're giving here. My comment there is triggered by the last comment you made there around shelter not being a solution to homelessness. So I wanted to invite you to think about another group of people who are experiencing homelessness, and these are the African refugees, for example. I am wondering about that statement to a person who is here, they are stranded, and we know they're not going to be stranded for long. And if they are not accorded a shelter, we know that their settlement process changes significantly. So if they have to be on the street for a month or more, it just does so many things to their being, to their person, that it really slows down their settlement process in so many ways. So I wanted to invite your insight on that now different kind of group in light of your comment earlier about shelters not being a solution to homelessness.
Yeah, I think you're exactly like Eddie. I think we're saying sort of the same thing, is that I believe shelter is essential to keeping people alive, but I don't think that we are going to solve our homelessness. What the refugees need is housing, right? What is going to solve that is actually houses for our and we work closely with the New Canadian Centre here in Peterborough around that, right? The answer is we need more housing for individuals. Shelter is harm reduction until we're able to get to that point of housing. So it's not that shelter is not important. It is incredibly important, right? But it is not the answer. And this is where I think sometimes we have, and sometimes within the church, I think this is our temptation, is that we oversell the thing we offer. When I go and speak places, I want everyone to hear, I don't think what we're doing is going to answer homelessness. I think what we're doing is keeping people alive. Now we buy houses and we own a bunch of houses and we house people. That I think, though it's not the thing that people are as interested in, that actually I think is doing something about showing a way forward to eliminate homelessness, but the shelter is just keeping people alive.
Thank you very much.
Often local churches.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Eddie. Yeah. Okay, so those, let's see. Is it a myth to say that encampments aggravate or increase substance abuse and addiction? You know what? I think encampments are I think they're a part of harm reduction as well, to be quite honest, right? We do not have enough spaces for people to live. I think the substance use and the addiction are there. I think why we think they aggravate it is that we see it when it's an encampment. It's not hidden from us. Again, whenever something is exposed to us. So an encampment, when an encampment happens, it means a community has come together and we're going to work together and we're not going to be forced to live separately, right? Also, encampments are often about we're not going to let you hide us anymore. Right? Like that's really what often, I've talked to many people in encampments who said, we just don't want you to, like, we exist, we can't not exist. We're gonna set up, right? We want community. So I think encampments don't necessarily aggravate it or increase it. It just makes it so we can see it. Someone said the stats, 38% will use something. Where are those stats from? I can get you, it was a study that was done in Calgary, but I can get you the exact name of where that study was from. Often local churches can assist refugees in some situations. I think that's right. I think that is one of the things that we've learned, I think, in refugee resettlement, which I think could be really interesting, is that wraparound support of individuals. That you've got a team who's helping you find housing, who's helping you find employment, who's helping. I mean, what we know is community works, and that makes a difference. Okay. They can't manage their money. There's been a recent study out in, it was done out in Vancouver, I think Vancouver, and I think this one is fascinating, where they gave $7,500 lump sum to 50 individuals experiencing homelessness. And what they found, and then the flip side of that is that they talked to just a lot of, people who were, middle-class people and said, what do you think is going to happen? What is the impact of this? And almost everyone was like, people are going to buy more drugs. People are going to buy whatever. They're going to spend it on temptation-based things. The results were the opposite. And I'm going to read this. What we saw is that very quickly, people in the cash group moved into stable housing faster. They spent fewer days homeless. They retained over 1,000 through 12 months, which is an incredible in a place like Vancouver in the Lower Mainland. It's really expensive to live here. We saw that there was an increased spending on food, clothing, rent, and that people were achieving greater food security. Then what I call the darling of our data set, we saw that people made wise financial choices with the money. So we saw a reduction by 39% in spending on drugs, alcohol, and tobacco. I call this the darling of our data set because it just flies in the face of the mainstream cultural narrative around people living in homelessness or poverty, that they can't be trusted to make wise financial choices, where in fact our data shows this is not the case. That's fascinating, isn't it? The idea that just giving people money actually led to people's lives getting better. Now, why naturally this is something that many of us retract at is because we're so embedded in the idea that the reason why people are experiencing homelessness is because they're making bad choices, right? They're making bad, and so if we gave them the money, they'll continue to make bad choices. But what if we began to show trust that maybe they can make some good choices? Now, that doesn't mean that any of us don't need support, right? And support is really important. Our housing is all support-based housing, but I think this can be really important. It's the link to it. I'll look it up, but it's the New Leaf project in Vancouver. So if you just Google New Leaf, it'll come up all over the place. A historian named Rutger Bregman talks a little bit about it, and it's quite interesting. So I'm going to talk about Peterborough here, but I think this is really interesting because when it talks about money management, and this is an example I constantly use, we have a 1.1% vacancy rate here in Peterborough, which means of all rental units, only 1.1% of them are vacant. We have a college and a university, which almost all those that are competing with those who are housing insecure for housing, which means those that we support almost never win in that vying for spaces. But if we look at it, $733 is what someone gets on a single person gets on Ontario Works. And apartments in Peterborough average a 1-bedroom at $870 per month. Now let me just name, there are barely any 1-bedroom apartments in Peterborough. So even if you could ever find it, the average is $870 per month. How do you manage $733 in a way that it becomes $870? There's no money management that makes 733 equal 870. Like it's ridiculous. And I think often insulting to individuals when we come to them with like financial management plans, when there's no way this can equal that, right? Like to sit down with someone and like, let's just work on budgeting right now. And they're like, okay, I have $733. And they're like, okay, so what's your rent? $870. We can't make that work, right? Like I'm bad at math, but I know that I can't make that happen, right? And so we need to hold on to, like, when we say it's just about managing money, that seems fairly foolish in the current market that we exist in. And so this managing money narrative is also one that we know is just not the case. And again, it's rooted in our need for control, right? We want to be able to control those who are marginalized. And it also allows us to sort of discredit them and say, this is maybe why we don't need to have responsibility for them. Someone said, we run a community meal program at Ask. Some people that come are homeless and working several jobs. These are not steady, good paying jobs that provide enough income to rent a place. Totally. And I mean, it's interesting to think of too, like when I bought my house 20 years ago, I could buy a house on a fairly low income. Now none of us get paid a whole lot here at One City, but those who get paid similar level to me could not afford to buy a house right now. Like it's not an option, and they're battling just to find an affordable place to rent, right? Like that is a real, like that's not a money managing. I'm not more responsible. That's why I own a house. It's because I bought one when things were cheap, and now they're not cheap anymore, right? Like that's the reality. And so sometimes it's those of us look at some of us look on those and saying that they're making bad choices when it was just that we got an opportunity in a time when it was easier to do so, right? And that's really important. I mean, an example of that we see often is we have a lot of seniors who are ending up in our shelter because they were renting the same place for 30 years. And it was a level that they could afford, but now that they've been rent evicted, maybe the landlord said they're gonna whatever's gonna happen, and now there is no way they can make their money last that. It lasted when they were paying the rent that they got then, but now it's not possible, and they have no options. I'm just gonna let this couple people in here. Okay. Next, and our last one. They're from somewhere else. This one I think is fascinating because it happens, it happens almost everywhere. I get the chance to speak in a lot of communities, and every community believes they're the community that everyone else ships their homeless people to. Like, it's a fascinating thing, right? Because I'm like, not everyone can be the place that everyone's being shipped to. Like, it just doesn't work. Someone has to be the shipper, right? Like it has to happen. But every community I go to, I ask them, is this what's said in your community, that things are really good here, and that's why that's why you have a homelessness crisis, is because it's really good here and people keep coming, right? Has anyone heard this in their own community? Yeah, it's a very common thing, and it's one, it can't be everywhere, right? That's the first. Two, the stats just don't agree with it. So I'm going to use Peterborough for an example, because I think I like using Peterborough, one, because I know it and I'm from here. But two, this is where companies test stores all the time, because we are, I guess, the most generic place. And so whenever they're doing a new store, they're like, let's try it out in Peterborough. It's generic. It's like small town and city at the same time. It's all the things. So I feel like we're a good testing ground for what's going on. And the stat that we have, this is done in our point in time count. And what we see here is only 10% of survey respondents have been in Peterborough for less than a year. So the amount of people experiencing who were experiencing homelessness, we know that the majority of them are from Peterborough, right? That's just, the stats show us the majority are from Peterborough. They're not from out of town. But here's the thing, is that it doesn't actually matter. We are allowed to move between cities. Like, that is just the reality, right? I am allowed to move to Oshawa. I mean, I wouldn't, because why would I leave the promised land to go somewhere else? But I'm allowed to go live somewhere else, right? I'm allowed to move around. And so this whole idea of like trying to say they're not one of us is something we only focus on people who are marginalized. We're okay with other people coming here, right? But when it comes to people who are marginalized, we're like, they're not allowed to be moving around. How do we stop them from moving from one community to another, right? Like, it doesn't actually matter if it were true. The only reason we're doing this is because if they're not ours, then we feel like we don't have to take responsibility for them. That's why we say this myth. They're not real Peterborough people, and so then we don't have to care for them, right? That is why we tell that story. And I think that's really important. Mary Lou says, does being human not automatically qualify someone for necessary support? We're not absolved from taking no action and not speaking out. I exactly agree, right? Like, we are, I mean, it is the same rhetoric that's used around immigration. It's the same around all of this, right? Yeah, and Benjamin, you're exactly right. It's an extension of them, not us. It is, and this is something that I will often, when I'm engaging with politicians on, because this is rhetoric they will constantly use, is they're from out of town. And I will say, that doesn't matter. And why are you using, one, stats it's not accurate. So where are you getting your stats from? But two, why are you committed to this narrative? Like, what's the purpose? Other than to say they're exactly, Benjamin, that they're a them, and so we don't have any responsibility for them. What we can see is all these 5 myths are wrapped up in this idea that that people are not our responsibility, right? That it's rooted in their choices, and so we don't have to take responsibility for it. And why it's important to name these myths and debunk them is because, again, most of our policy is built on these myths. If we can take most of our responses and say, we developed, Ontario Works became punitive, right? Like, got revamped in the 90s and became punitive because of the idea that people who are living in poverty are untrustworthy, right? Like, it was built on, even if it was discredited, it was built on that myth. Many of our policy decisions are built on myths. And so we need to debunk them, and then begin to say, okay, how do we begin to imagine solutions that address the real roots of the issue, right? How do we begin to say, okay, if this is about us as a system, as a political entities, making choices that leave people out, how do we begin to address those issues? And the answers are not on the next slide, because I would wish I could say that. I wish I could say, let me tell you how we address this issue. And I don't have the answer on the next slide. But I think we need to begin to do the imaginative work to begin to imagine what could happen, right? But we can only get to that imaginative place if we get rid of these myths that are influencing the answer that we think right now. Does that make sense? Any thoughts? Yeah. Yes. Catherine.
I'm just so powerfully feeling that your message has to be told everywhere and in schools and in high schools. So the young people too are understanding this and maybe not listening to social media or parents. None of us are perfect as parents. The message those kids are getting about people they see on the street. So you have a big job. You have to go all over the world and give this message.
Well, thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Well, here's the interesting thing, and is that I do go to schools often to talk about this, because I mean, and I will say the scariest thing about that is, especially with elementary kids, is that I remember one time when the encampment was happening in Peterborough, one of the encampments was in Peterborough, and I was trying to talk about the idea, like, again, there's a huge anger around people experiencing homelessness, and I was trying to bring some compassion around these kids, and it's easy with elementary. The compassion, like, is right there with them, right? They want to be compassionate, and one of the kids put up her hand, and she's like, the other day I was driving with my dad and we went past the encampment and he's like, they'll be moved soon. We'll get rid of them. What do you think about that? And I was like, oh, just heartbreaking, right? Because it's coming from their parents, right? The reason these kids want to be compassionate and they're being taught by those around them that actually those people are disposable.
So Sandra Fawcett is asking, how can you overcome public resistance? So she's trying to create a shelter for men in Etobicoke. How do you overcome that public resistance? And I mean, it's systemic, right? You've already just indicated that it's a case where people don't want it in their own backyard, it seems, and they try to distance themselves from the problem. Anyway, I leave it up to you, Christian.
Yeah. No, easy answer. No, I'm just joking. I mean, you can if you just Google One City Peterborough, you'll see that there is a lot of, we haven't figured out how to overcome resistance. There's a lot of people who are quite angry at us on a regular basis because they're angry that their community is changing. And I get that, right? Like, if we begin to address these issues, we will, the stigma that is put on those experiencing homelessness, we will begin to face it. That's just the reality of it, right? Like people are angry that their communities are changing, and for them, it makes most sense to blame the victims and anyone who's supporting that victim. And I think, from my point of view, I would rather them be mad at me than those who, like, I have resources to deal with that, right? But those who are experiencing homelessness do not, right? And so if we as an organization can begin to offer some protection for them from that vitriol, we're okay with that. That doesn't give you an answer of how we overcome it. Part of it is, like, we do a lot of narratives around we are often kind of giving another story. Often nonprofits are quite quiet around the issues, and so we are not. And I think that's really important. I think nonprofits have actually a moral responsibility to be public about the things they're seeing. One of the things I'll also say is nonprofits sometimes are a bit too apologetic about the issues that come because of their existence. What I will say regularly, I can't take responsibility for hiding homelessness from you. My goal is to keep people alive and to keep people fed with a roof over their head. I can't take your discomfort on as well. I don't want to diminish that it's uncomfortable to see people in desperate space. That's a really hard thing. And I want to hear that. And I want to sit with someone as they're dealing with that. But that's not what, success for me isn't that you feel more comfortable, right? And that's really important. There was 4 walls and a roof is not a home. When a houseless person was given an apartment by Streets to Home in our community, he lost his community, became lonely, became distraught, and became ill. That is why we began to develop community land trust. Yeah, you know what? So I think what you're saying there is exactly right. Is that what we under a lot of our housing programs don't take into account how important community is, right? And again, community, autonomy are actually, like, sense of belonging, sense of autonomy are 2 essential needs that we often don't take into account when developing our programs. So our housing program, one of the things that we do is, again, we only create 4-bedroom houses. So all our houses are congregate, but we only do 4-bedroom houses because it's within that we believe community can be built. Our staff aren't just doing individual case management, they're doing community development within the homes so that people can feel like it's not a rooming house, but a home with roommates that are there. We also make sure that those who are, when a room becomes available in a house, that the others in that house have a say on who moves in, right? That they have a say in who their roommate's going to be. I would want that, right? I want a say in who lives with me. And so we are going to make sure that they have a say in that as well. Because you're right. If we think housing is just about getting someone indoors and we take all relational elements of it, we have misunderstood what housing is. Community groups made an impressive presentation to council for supportive housing in Aurora. The NIMBYism was so fierce it was voted down, but Blue Door is spearheading this in the York region. I mean, the thing is around NIMBYism right now is, and that I think is a bit worrisome, I mean, it's very worrisome, is that people are beginning to own the term. Like, it's not even something that people are embarrassed by. They're like, yeah, not in my backyard. That's a fascinating turn that we're seeing. And I think that is where we need to engage in both like loud and subversive change. So what we do around housing is we just buy homes. No one can stop us from buying a 4-bedroom home and choosing who we want to house in that home. That's not something anyone can stop us from doing, right? There's no zoning that needs to be changed for that. There's nothing. We're building a tiny home in the backyard of one of our homes. Again, that fits within the zoning that's allowed in that area. So you can do a lot of subversive housing that actually is quite easy to do that no one can stop, even if it's frustrating in a neighborhood, right? The builds are hard, and we need to do builds, but we can do a lot of subversive housing in the current market that no one can stop. And that begins to bring change in a very real way. And a lot has come up around basic income supplement. I think you're exactly right that a lot of this is income related. We need to hit that. We also need to we need to address the commodification of housing. Housing now has become an investment. If something is an investment where we make money, then it is bought up by some and not available to others. That's what makes it an investment, right? When housing was wartime homes, we saw it as something that was needed, and so we provided it. That lowered the house prices would go down if we did wartime housing, and that is only an issue because we made housing something that is where we put our investments, right? And so we don't see it as a need. We need to creatively address that. We also need to find ways in which to do entry-level housing, which is so important. Someone asked, how are you managing to buy houses? Here's the thing. So what we do with housing, we have a bit of a creative model. We started we had a landlord who said, I'd be interested in housing people coming out of homelessness, but I have no expertise on that. What if we hire you to be the property management? And so we've started a property management firm that is nonprofit, where if someone hires us to manage their properties, we then house people coming out of homelessness in that home. That's how we started. Then what we did is because often those that we work with, eventually maybe they are like, you know what, it makes more sense for you to own this house. And so we buy it off them, sometimes at a bit of a reduced rate, but at least not on the market where we're not going to be able to compete, right? And so if we could buy it not on the market, it allows us to develop a fundraising campaign. So we fundraise for all our houses. So we have 7 houses that we own that are around homelessness, and we have 2 that are around that are CRFs, or halfway houses. And so that's how we bought every one of them, is through donations, and we don't have like a huge pot of money that we can develop from. We just, when we have a house, we say, hey, we have a house. Does anyone want to invest in that? And usually we have donors who will step up and get us the down payment, and then the rents pay for the rest of it. I've been seeing praises for the development of little homes in Nova Scotia for people who are unhoused. I'm uneasy with the solution, as I understand the development is a bus ride from town, has no parking for guests, distance to library stores. It seems to be a way to hide homelessness by moving it. I'd be interested in your thoughts. I think that's a really interesting, so this is a constant solution that's given regularly, is because, as you can imagine, our Trinity Center, the center that we operate, everyone says it's just not in the right neighborhood. It's an important service that isn't in the right space. Well, we also recognize that there is no right space. There will never be a space that is a good space to operate a program like this, and that exists. And so when I say that, I was like, is there a neighborhood that would be a good? They're like, no, but it should be way out of town where no one can access, like way out of town where no one can see it. And I'm like, that's kind of, isn't that what we did around Indigenous peoples and reserves? We said, we're going to create a separate place where you can go where we don't have to see you. Like, didn't we learn from the destructive nature of that sort of oppression, right? Like that is what we have done in the past, right? Is that it's basically an expulsion with kinder words is what happens. Now, I don't want to say, I'm not speaking, this tiny home community in Nova Scotia might be, for some people, it might be great, right? I don't want to ever make a comment that says there is a variety of things that work for, there's a group of people I'm sure that we could find here that want to be in the country, right? And that's beautiful. I think tiny homes are not the answer, but one of many solutions that can begin to be used to address issues, right? I think the more tools we have, the better. But I think that it's dangerous when our answer is to send people out of town. I think that should always be something that we should be. I'm weary of that because it's usually like it's a nicer way to just exclude people. That being said, this community might be working really well. I don't know anything about it. I know that it's been done a few places, and some of them are like beautiful communal spaces. And so I don't want to. I'm not passing judgment on that. Just any sort of narrative around that worries me a little bit. Sandra, when St. Cydians was initially trying to set up an Out of the Cold program, we had very intense opposition. We held open community engagement meetings, actually listening to people's concerns so that we could help dispel myths. We had representatives from existing program in a similar area to help speak to the fact that they did not suffer from increased crime, decrease in property value. Also, speaker explained how we become homeless. Yeah, I mean, I think engaging in the community is really, really important. But I also, here's the reality, at least in our situation, is that operating our program here does increase crime in this neighborhood. It does increase the negative impact on the direct neighborhood and decreases it on the community as a whole. Does that make sense? Like, we have 300 people coming here with very complicated issues every day. There is no way you can do that doesn't have an increased impact on that neighborhood, because we have so many people who are struggling to survive with really complex needs and issues, right? Like that's a reality. So I never want to downplay it and say, I think that's actually sometimes we lean into like, it's not going to do anything. At least if you're running a program like ours, it will do something, right? It's good for the community as a whole. For like police, this is much better for them, right? Like this is because people aren't loitering all over the place. But for this neighborhood, it is harder on that neighborhood. And so one of the things I often am naming is, you're right. We have brought increased concerns to your neighborhood. I don't want to downplay that. And we will continue to try and address this in whatever way we can. But also just owning the fact that it's there, right? Any other questions? What I want to do is then have so most of you are probably on board, right? Like most of you are not like, I disagree. And so I think we have 10 more minutes. Is that right, Peter?
Yeah, we can do 10 more minutes. We can go a little bit longer if you'd like. It's just, but at least 10 minutes. Okay.
So what I want to talk about, sorry, I'm going to do one more question. During COVID, City of Toronto leased motels for homeless. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing, is that we know that, I mean, there's been so many studies done around the idea that when we have an increase in inequality, crime increases, like all these things increase, right? We are at our highest level of inequality, right? So obviously these things are there, right? Like that is the reality of it. And so the services that are there to help manage, like those like ours, that are there to manage the predictable impacts of allowing an increased inequality in our economic systems, are not to blame for the issues that are happening. You know what I mean? Like this is the thing, is I'm like, you in the political realm made decisions that have allowed inequality to increase. What we're doing is trying to help the victims of those decisions. We're not going to take the blame for the fact that these things exist.
Right.
Okay, so I want to talk about some tips on how to engage in these conversations, because I think what needs to happen is we need to begin to address the issues themselves. All right, we need to begin to, and that's only going to happen if we begin to talk to those in our sphere of influence to begin to try and bring down some of the myths and allow and then begin to have creative solutions, creative conversations about what solutions might be. Because as you can see, those 5 myths are all about othering the other, the person experiencing homelessness. It's all about saying they're not one of us. They're not our responsibility. And Miroslav Volf in Exclusion and Embrace, some of you might know that book. He talks about what we do with the other. And he says, often if the other is in our midst, we'll allow them to continue if they can assimilate. If you can just become whatever we define as normal, we'll let you be a part. So if you get housed, you get a job, you live so that we don't have to notice you as being making us uncomfortable, you can stick around in our community. 2, we dominate. And that domination can look a few different ways. Often it'll look like we'll let you stick around if you make us feel good about ourselves. Okay, so that domination looks like, I often hear talk about the panhandler who is grateful and says thank you and makes the person giving the money feel good. That's the good panhandler. He's allowed to stick around because he makes me feel good about my generosity and my kindness, right? The one who is in mental health crisis, he doesn't make me feel good about that. The one who has Tourette's, who swears all the time, he doesn't make me feel good. And so he's not able to stay. But the one who allows me to dominate them so that I can feel good about myself, that one can stick around, right? We can think of how that looks in a variety of ways. I mean, often sometimes within our church programs, I mean, I'm sure none of yours, but in other places, sometimes we have our outreach services in the basement, but we really hope those people don't come upstairs to church on Sunday, right? Like we want them there so that we can feel good about the services we offer. We don't want them to worship with us as equals because that makes us feel uncomfortable, right? And so those sorts of things would be that domination piece. Abandonment, I mean, that could be, that's sometimes we just have neighborhoods that we just abandon and you're like, we'll give it to destruction and it allows us, we ignore the issue as if it's happening. I think shelters are often a form of abandonment. If we can get shelters, then we don't have to do anything about the next step, right? As long as we don't see it. And then lastly, expulsion, right? Community, forcing it to be outside of town, that prison. We criminalize homelessness, right? Like we criminalize many of the people who are filling our prisons are living in poverty, right? Like these sorts of things. And so these are the ways we often address when we think of it as the other in our midst. And we can see how our solutions that we have are there. When we look at the solutions that we have to homelessness, they're wrapped in these things: assimilation, trainings to make people feel like to make them better tenants. Not that that's a bad thing, but we're just trying. It's all about how do we make the person be better? Domination. We want people to be the deserving poor to whom we can offer charity. Forced treatment would be a form of that as well. Abandonment. Give up on the areas of town. Avoid places that make us uncomfortable. Expulsion, bylaws, settlements, those sorts of things. And so we have these solutions. So how do we have these conversations? How do we have meaningful conversations that persuade? And we only have a couple minutes, so I want to go through some things. I have learned, so I've gone through this thing in the last 2 months where I've been meeting with, I've been reaching out to leaders of evangelical churches to connect around harm reduction. The reason why is that I knew that their congregations are the very people who are trying to be polarized by politicians who are talking about safe consumption sites as drug dens, that safe supply is making our kids addicted, and all those sorts of things. This rhetoric that's out there, and so I wanted to have conversations with those who are not the choir. There's lots of people I could talk to who are on board with it, but how do I have conversations with those who are actually susceptible to this rhetoric that's happening? And so I've been reaching out, and some of the things I've learned, and a lot of these come from something called deep canvassing, which is a really interesting technique that's come out of the States. And it's around these issues of we need to just have conversations with people, not necessarily to bring them over to my side, but I need to be able to put doubt in the narrative they currently have so that they begin to think, okay, maybe this isn't quite the case. So I'm engaging in a way that is not. I'm not going to engage in a debate. That's not going to get anyone, because when we engage in debate, though they're fun, I love a good debate. But when I'm debating someone, I don't actually think that they're going to be convinced by my debate, because I'm not going into it thinking I'm going to be convinced by theirs. I'm going in to win, right? So how do I enter into conversation that is actually where we're both open to hearing each other? So I think a few things that are really important is, one, non-judgmentally inviting people to open up about their real conflicted feelings on an issue, right? So when a neighbor is saying, I don't know what to do because I really don't like seeing people using substances out in the open, instead of having an answer for why that should be okay, I want to dig deeper and hear them talk about that. I want to allow them to say the things that they need to be said. I need to allow them to ask the questions that might be ignorant, right? Because they might be asking really ignorant and sort of offensive conversations, but I can hold that space one-on-one with them, because even if it sounds ignorant, it's real to them and we need to address it. So I want to hold that space instead of getting defensive, instead of going in with my 5 myths on homelessness and debunking everyone that they say. That's not actually going to persuade them. What will lead to persuasion is actually hearing them, right? I want to share vulnerability about my own life and their own life. We're going to connect through that sort of vulnerability. I'm going to ask curious questions about the voter's life, specifically the experiences that have shaped them, that make them feel a certain way about an issue. An example of this was, again, I grew up in the Pentecostal church, and when I was quite involved in the church in general in Peterborough for quite a long time, and have sort of been the face of some sort of controversial stances within the according to maybe more conservative churches. And so that's a really political way of saying I was a bit of a controversial figure in evangelical churches. And what that would result in is a lot of times young men would contact me to have debates. and that usually it was like, hey, you want to grab coffee? I'd love to hear your thoughts on something. And that was always code for, I'm going to try debating Christian Harvey, right? Because he's like this figure, which is fun. But anyway, one time this guy contacted me, and he wanted to debate women in ministry, women as priests, or hey, they didn't have priests, but women as ministers. And he's like, and he was like, how can you justify, based on the Bible, women in ministry? And I was like, okay, here's the thing, is that what we could do right now is I could give you all the verses that justify my point of view. And then you could give all the ones that justify your point of view, and we'll throw those verses at each other, and we'll both feel really good about ourselves at the end, and nothing will happen. But what I'm more interested in hearing is, why is this so important to you? Like, why is the fact that women aren't leaders, why is that so important to you? Because I can tell you why it's important to me that they are. Because there's been women in leadership who have impacted my faith life in ways no one else had, and how could I ever deny that they had a call to be a pastor, right? Like, I just couldn't. And I was like, so I'll give you that, but that's what's really important to me. And that moment of vulnerability of saying, like, I'm not going to convince you, but this is why it's important to me. And I was like, why is this important to you? I'd really love to hear. And after a minute, he was kind of silent, and he's like, actually, it's because I'm really scared of what it means if I have to give up leadership. And I was like, I'd love to hear more about that. Like, that is scary, right? But that was there. We got, and I don't know where he went after that, right? I don't know, because these guys would just contact me and want to have. But what was cool is at the end of it, he was wrestling with his own kind of, oh yeah, this is not about the biblical verses. This is about my own fear around loss of position, right? And I think that's what we often see when we're able to have those conversations instead of just the debates. I think being open, I'll finish off right now, being open and honest about being allowed for them to be open and honest about their own truth and beliefs is really important, and us being open and honest about ours, but again, in a way that doesn't have to be confrontational. And I think also offering the golden gate of retreat. This is used in advocacy circles, and I love it a lot. It's this idea of, like, when someone changes, they're going to try and find a way to save face as they change their views. We don't need to point out that they changed, like, hey, remember what you did believe and now you do? They're going to retell that story of like, I've always been welcoming of, and I don't need to ever call that out, right? Like I allow them a way to retreat that does not, that allows them to save face.
Right.
I'm going to be much more productive that way.